Warm welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for the Can You Cap It webinar. My name is Michaela Skodova, and I'm the Can You Cap It Communications Manager. I will be hosting and facilitating today's webinar. I hope everyone can hear me okay. If not, please try to send me a chat question or use the chat window via your panel to contact me if you cannot hear me. You are muted on entry, so you won't be actually able to talk using your microphone, but you do have a chance to ask questions as this webinar is interactive. Please use the panel on your right-hand side and make sure you send the message to the organizer. I'm here today with Professor Franco Sotte, one of today's speakers, who is a professor in agricultural economics at the Polytechnic University of the Marche in Italy, and he's the scientific coordinator of the online e-learning course CAP Pro on our Can EU Cap It platform. People will be still joining us, so if there are any issues throughout, please do not hesitate to contact me. And before we start, I would like to just say what the Can EU Cap It project is. The Can EU Cap It project is a learning platform that is co-financed by the European Commission, and the use of the platform and its features is to provide learning tools about the reformed CAP and to offer a place for discussion. So I encourage you to join us after we finish the session in one of our forums. Professor Franco Sotte will shortly explain the decision by the member states on the implementation of the direct payments. The presentation will last approximately 20 minutes, and in the following 10 minutes you will have a chance to get your questions answered. If we run out of time, I apologize, and we'll try to get your questions answered afterwards. We will also be recording this event, so everyone who missed it will be able to listen to it later. Without further ado, I would like to get to our topic. So, welcome, Franco. Can you hear me okay?
Hello, I'm here.
Okay, I'm happy to give you the floor now if you'd like to start your presentation.
Okay. Let me show my screen. Can you see the screen now, my screen?
Yes, I can see it perfectly fine.
Okay, well, the presentation I am going to present to you is the result of research done with Francesca Bignami, who is a senior policy advisor at Copa Cogeca. And our study has been prepared for an information report for the European Economic and Social Committee, the NAT session. The subject was about the evaluation of member states' decision on direct payments. Rapporteur Mario Campli. This study will be presented in a public hearing on May 19th. The next month. As you know, several decisions on direct payments have been left to member states, and this is one of the main novelties in the 2014-2020 CAP reform. The analysis done for the European Economic and Social Committee has done this structure. First, an inventory of the decisions transferred to member states. Second, the selection of the most relevant decision. Third, the definition of a metric for the analysis of those decisions. Then we have attributed values using a Likert scale on the decisions. To be used as a quantitative basis for an analysis and an interpretation of results. Finally, we have tried to identify the behavior patterns of the member states. We conclude this presentation with some conclusive remarks. This is, in short, an inventory of decisions left to member states. Probably they are not at all exhaustive, But as you can see, the decisions have covered a very wide range of subjects of the regulation on direct payments, active farmer, minimum requirement, reduction on payment. Here I've written just the articles where the decisions have been transferred, and the number of decisions, just listing the number of them, and as you can see in the bottom of the screen, 24 articles contain something that records the intervention of member states, and the decisions to be taken by member states are in number, in figures, 48, at least 48, because we are not sure to have the complete coverage of all the decisions taken by member states. Well, in this sheet, you see the 7 on the left, the 7 key decisions that we have taken into consideration: active farmer, minimum requirements, flexibility between pillars, regionalization and convergence, greening, voluntary coupled support, reduction of direct payments, and capping. For each set of decisions, we have defined a minimum value considering the most conservative possibility that the member state was allowed to take, and we have attributed a maximum value to the most reforming decisions that could be taken by the member states. For instance, flexibility between pillars. We have considered the minimum value, the transfer from the second to the first pillar of money from the second to the first pillar, and we have given 5, the maximum value, to those countries that has transferred money from the first to the second pillar. Let's take another, greening. On greening, we have given 5 to those countries that have applied a flat rate per hectare to the greening measures, while only 1 is attributed to those countries that has adopted a green payment in percentage to the value of individual basic payment. You can see in the other row that more or less this rule has been applied to all the other decisions. And this is the list of the attributed values. Naturally, this exercise is strongly subjective. One can have another opinion, but anyway, we have tried to be as much objective as we could be, but anyway, the exercise is a subjective exercise. So 5 is in the cases when the country has decided to be very innovative. 1 is when the country has decided to be very, very restrictive to the applying the measure at the minimum level possible with the regulation. This is, for instance, one of the representation, a map of the presentation of flexibility. Poland is white because Poland and some other countries in the new member states have adopted the decision to transfer money from the second to the first pillar, while England, Wales, and Scotland, as well as Estonia, has decided the opposite, to transfer money from the first pillar to the second. Well, the different color in the map represent the intermediate decisions. This is for convergence. Convergence has been fully adopted, a full convergence by the UK member state, by the Netherlands, by Germany, Austria, and Sweden and Finland, while Italy, France, Spain, and the Mediterranean country in particular have decided to adopt a convergence, to apply the convergence at the minimum level of the Irish convergence. This is with flexibility what has been done. Gone. Convergence, flexibility, greening. Greening, the countries in white are those that have applied the greening in percentage to the basic payment, to the at level of each farmer, the beneficiaries. In black, those that have applied the greening in on a flat basis per hectare. This is a couple payment, where the couple payment have been applied mostly is clear, where the couple payment have been not adopted or adopted at a very low level. You will see a dark color. Well, this is a synthesis of all the main 7 most relevant decisions. We have applied on the matrix that I presented before a factor analysis, and this is the synthetic representation of all of the results. On this plan, you can imagine that the arrow on the right pull towards the high minimum requirement. It depends on the correlation between the variables of the factor analysis and the original values. We will see on the right those countries that has adopted the flexibility from first to the second pillar or low and no couple payment. On the bottom, those countries that have adopted the flat green payment. As you see, each variable has the opposite on the other side, so we can imagine that the distribution of each country on the sheet depends on the balance of all the decisions that they have taken. Given the boost and attraction effects of all the variables in one side or the other, as is written into the arrows on the margin. Well, the first image is that the space on the sheet is covered completely by the different cases. So there is one evident distribution on the screen covering all the possibilities, and this emphasize how differentiated have been the decisions taken by member states. But if we want to find some behavior pattern, we can probably see some vicinity between cases, some convergence. This is one. The countries like Austria, Denmark, Sweden, Luxembourg, Netherlands, and the 4 territorial entities of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, have chosen in general, albeit with nuances that differentiate the cases among them, to shift money from direct payments to rural development, the full convergence of direct payments, abandoning any reference to the historic basis, and the flat green payments for all the hectares. They have also adopted the decision to renounce to activate a couple of measures, or to do it in a very limited extent. In this group could also be included Germany, but it appears in a more isolated position, especially in relation to its choices in terms of minimum requirements, less selective than in other cases. A second typological model brings together member states located in the northwest side of the graph. These are Italy, France, Spain, Greece, Ireland, and the two territorial entities of Belgium, Flanders, and Wallonia. These countries have adopted solutions in continuity with the past, convergence with the Irish method, the minimum allowed by the regulation, greening as a percentage and in proportion to the individual direct payment, basic payment, strong weight of couple payment, and in this group it could also be included Poland, which appears, however, in a position on the left of the graph as a result mainly of his choice to operate a substantial transfer of resources from the second pillar to the first. The third group is the one circled in the middle and at the bottom of the graph. Are part of this group, generally apart from Finland, a number of new member states from Central and Eastern Europe: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Cyprus, Malta, Czech Republic. And the inclusion in this group depends on the single area payment scheme. It has the flat direct payments per hectare adopted since the Fischler reform. In fact, in these countries, the full convergence has already been implemented by definition, and this is also reflected in a flat green payment per hectare. In general, this historical condition is accompanied by decisions aimed at maintaining the status quo ante, no or limited reduction, no selection between beneficiaries, and low minimum requirement. Out of this classification are 4 other member states. Croatia and Hungary are especially characterized by the transfer of funds from the second pillar to the first, the substantial weight of the couple measures, and the redistribution of support made by the capping or payment in early hectares, and the low level of minimum requirement. Portugal and Bulgaria have also opted for a stronger weight of couple measures, but didn't use the flexibility between pillars. Well, this is a synthesis. Just some conclusive comments. Member state decisions on direct payments are really a patchwork of diverse choices, hard to synthesize. We have tried to do it, but and anyway, those decisions will affect the free competition between member states. This is not due to the responsibility only of the member states, because the transfer of decision of 2 member states in Regulation 1307 has been motivated first by not by a strategy nor by a subsidiarity principle, the application of a subsidiarity principle, but especially by the urgency to conclude the trialogue with a decision or a compromise. You remember that anyway the direct payment has started 1 year later, despite the compromise taken at the very last moment in July 2013. No surprise then that once transferred the responsibility to the member states, they have followed their interests, especially those supported by the most vested lobbies inside each member states. Final questions for further research. From now on, how much is the cap still a common policy, and how much is the single market still single? But probably the reply to this question can be left to further research once that one can evaluate what are the outcome of those decisions, especially in the on the competitive side, and what are the outcome of those decisions in terms of the capacity of the Europe to maintain common this policy that is really a little bit differentiated member state by member state.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, Franco. Sorry, thank you for that. Would it be okay if we get to the questions now?
Yeah, please.
Okay, perfect. First question is from one of our participants that says, in my opinion, the CAP reform for direct payments is very complicated and it will lead to more bureaucracy. The Commission and Commissioner Hogan are looking for ways to simplify the CAP. How could the CAP direct payment system be simplified?
That's a very nice question. I don't know, because you know, simplification on direct payment. Well, the problem is that direct payment have been complicated to solve the problem of their internal contradiction. Well, direct payment were simplified when they were only one simple transfer in the pocket of farmers given by historical or on historical basis or on a per hectare basis in the eastern countries. The problem is that the simplification frequently is against the objective systematically recalled by the European documents of targeting and tailoring the policies in Europe. The decision to divide in 7 measures the direct payments and to allow the member states to further decide on the application of those measures has inevitably complicated the story, and I do not see any easy way to simplify the way, but simplification is frequently something that is against targeting and tailoring. You know, this is
okay, perfect. Yeah, I think it answered the question. So I'm aware of the time, so a few more questions, and we'll try to answer them as quickly as possible. So the next question would be, how subsidies given for EU member countries are equal to their GDP of agriculture?
Sorry.
So there's a question: how subsidies given for EU member countries are equal to their GDP of agriculture? If that does that, I'm sorry that that question doesn't really shout too much of a. Okay, let's give an opportunity for the participant to correct this answer, this question. And I have another question for you. In the meantime, will the greening measures improve the environmental performance of agriculture?
I fear not that much. Well, the greening measures it's been a solution to adopted not to green not to really implement. This is my opinion anyway. Not to really implement the environmental, the capacity of the CAP to solve the environmental problem of Europe. The greening measures have been adopted in the first pillar to maintain the money in the direct payment systems. There was a room, clear room, well-defined room, where the environmental objective should be treated, and this is the second pillar. The duplication with the first pillar was just a way to, an attempt to green the first pillar, but the first pillar is very difficult to be green, to become green, because the system of direct payments is not adapted nor adaptable to the objective of a more environmental friendly agriculture. So my opinion is that the only way to green really the CAP is to move the money, to unify the policies for environmental purposes into the second pillar. The attempt to green the first pillar has been tried, but as you see, only a marginal part of Europe will have to change something due to the greening, and probably the results will be not as someone had expected. The lobbies anyway have raised the lower limit where the application of the greening should be compulsory. For instance, in Italy, a very small part of land is affected really by the obligation of the greening.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Franco. I'm afraid this is the time we had for all the questions. I will forward the remaining ones to you via email. Thank you for everyone listening in for Franco's sessions on the member states on the implementation of direct payments. Franco, thank you so much for being with us today, and I will now. Thank you, and I will now give in a few seconds, Alan Matthews will join us, so Franco, stay on and listen in as well, hopefully.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. So I hope everyone can hear me okay. Welcome everyone, whoever is joining us for Alan's session, for our second session of today's webinar. Today's session by Alan Matthews, who is the Professor Emeritus of European Agriculture Policy in Ireland, and also one of the lecturers of the online e-learning course CAP Pro here on the platform, is delivering a session on geographical indications as an issue in the TTIP negotiations. If you're just joining us now, my name is Michaela Skodova and I'm the CANEU CAPIT Communications Manager. I will be hosting and facilitating the webinar today. You are muted on entry, so you won't actually be able to talk using your microphone, but please feel free to ask questions. The questions will be asked in by the end of the webinar, and we'll also record this session. If everyone missed it, you can listen to it later. The session is planned to last approximately for 30 minutes. I apologize for the short delay. And then now I'm delighted to welcome Alan. Alan, can you hear me? The floor is yours.
Okay, well, apologies to everybody listening in, and you're very welcome to this webinar this afternoon. I'm sorry for that technical problem. I want to spend a few minutes looking at this issue of geographical indications, which is one of the issues being discussed in the free trade negotiations between Europe and the United States, what's called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Now, as I think everybody will know, the TTIP, the TTIP as it's referred to, the negotiations began last year. We've just completed the 9th negotiating round just in the past week or so. It has proved to be a very controversial issue in Europe, and those who are in favor point to the potential economic gains in terms of increased jobs, increased economic activity. Those who are more critical of the agreement point to the dangers of regulatory reduction in regulatory standards, particularly in terms of food safety and other issues within Europe. What I want to do is to focus on just one issue, which is this question of geographical indications, which is one of the EU's offensive interests in the negotiations. Now, what is a geographical indication? Well, the definition which is given in the TRIPS agreement of the WTO, TRIPS is the Agreement on Intellectual Property, calls it indications which identify a good as originating in the territory of a member or a region or locality in that territory, where a given quality, reputation or other characteristic of the good is essentially attributable to its geographical origin. So in other words, there should be this essential link between the location where the product is produced and some aspect of its quality, its reputation or its characteristic. The European Union has a very extensive acquis, which it takes the form of what's called a sui generis system, that's to say a sort of unique system of protection for agricultural products and foodstuffs, and also for wines and spirits. And there's now a substantial number of products which have received this protection within the European Union. Around April last year, we had over 300 names of spirits, over 1,500 names of wines, and over 1,100 names of foodstuffs and agricultural products. If we look at the importance of these products which have received this protection, around 15% of all EU food and drink exports consist of products that have been protected with geographical indications, although a very substantial proportion, over 90% of these, are actually wines and spirits. A further characteristic of GIs is that these export values are concentrated in actually quite a small number of products. So good examples might be champagne and cognac from France, Scotch whisky from the United Kingdom, Grana Padano, Parmigiano Reggiano from Italy. So really quite a small number of products actually comprise the great majority of these export earnings. Nonetheless, geographical indications are part of the European Union's policy to focus on premium products. We understand that we're not going to be competitive in terms of basic commodity production against countries that have much larger endowments of land areas, such as the United States and Brazil, but we do have a strong tradition in producing high quality foodstuffs, and we want to try to get recognition for this high quality by recognition of these geographical indications, not just in Europe, but in other countries, including the United States. And the picture here shows you some examples of what European Union producers are concerned about. For example, in the top left we have a picture of Asiago cheese. Asiago is a protected name within the European Union, and you can see from the wrapping on this cheese, it has both the United States but also the Italian flag, suggesting that this is in fact coming from Italy, but in fact it's a United States producer. Similarly, we have Parmesan cheese, we have feta cheese in the middle, we have champagne produced by an American producer on the left, and Toma cheese on the right. Now, we're going to see that actually not all of these names are protected in the European Union, and there is a distinction between protected names and what are called common or generic names, which are names which have entered into the public consciousness, if you like, and really are no longer associated with a particular geographic region. So what are the positions of the negotiations or the negotiators on this issue? From the European Union side, there's a clear mandate from the European Council to the negotiators that they should try to that they should aim to provide for enhanced protection and recognition of the EU geographical indications. in a manner that complements and builds upon sort of existing protection under WTO, World Trade Organization rules. Also addressing the relationship with prior use on the US market with the aim of solving existing conflicts in a satisfactory manner. So in other words, where an American producer already has used the name or indeed has registered the name as a trademark and these conflicts exist, that clearly has to be resolved. On the US side, the US trade representative in their outline of the objectives that they have for the TTIP negotiations, they seek new opportunities to advance and defend the interests of US farmers with respect to strong protection and effective enforcement of intellectual property rights, including their ability to compete in foreign markets. Now, the US does have a system to protect geographical indications, but it's a different system to the European Union. In the United States, geographic indications can be protected as trademarks. So GIs can be registered either as a collective mark or a certification mark, which are part of the overall US trademark system. And there are examples of European Union GIs which have received protection in this way in the United States. For example, Roquefort cheese is protected as a certification mark, and cognac is also recognized as a regional certification mark. However, there are a number of criticisms of the US system from a European Union perspective. The European Union objects to the trademark system for GIs because it uses the first come, first served rules. In other words, if somebody has already registered a trademark, that prevents anybody else from subsequently using that. And the European Union feels that that discriminates against geographical indications, which have this unique and particular attribute that that the quality, reputation, or other characteristics are linked to the location where the product is produced. There's also evidence that in North America, there's an overly restrictive view of what is a common name. Trademarks have to be distinctive, and very often that rules out geographic names and denies registration to many EU GIs. Another problem with the trademark system is that registration in the first place and then enforcement of your trademark rights through the court system can be very difficult and expensive. And there's a more general criticism that the trademark system in the US doesn't fully recognize this unique notion of GIs as being essentially attributable to where they are produced. So what are the objectives then that the European Union has in these TTIP negotiations for GIs? It wants to guarantee an appropriate level of protection for GIs. It wants to try to get the US to agree to administrative enforcement against the misuse of EU GIs. In other words, that producers don't have to go through the court system with all the costs that involves, but that those who are responsible for administering the register would take action themselves when misuse is brought to their attention. They want to establish a list of GI names which would be protected directly through the agreement, and they obviously will have specific arrangements for those GI names where there are conflicts which have already been registered, for example, in the US. They also would like to see greater and better protection for those wine names which already have some protection in the US under a previous US-EU wine agreement. And the EU is looking to extend the number of spirits produced in the European Union which also have this protection. Now, what is the US reaction to the European Union negotiating position? Well, here's a quote from Paul Ryan, one of the Republican congressmen, and he says, "We are going to keep making Gouda in Wisconsin, and feta and cheddar and everything else." So it's extremely important that we do not allow these countries to use these kinds of improper barriers to block US dairy exports. Now, this position is particularly pushed in the US by the Consortium for Common Food Names, which is, you can look at its website and find out more about its position. It is largely made up of the dairy industry, but not only, but it recognizes, it supports the idea of geographical indications associated with specialized foods from regions throughout the world, but it opposes any attempt to monopolize what they consider to be common or generic names that have become part of the public domain. Now, they've produced a set of guidelines that they think might be helpful to establish a sort of fair model that protects these common names while also protecting legitimate food-related GIs. So its view on the EU position is that it's taking a mechanism that was created to protect consumers against misleading information and instead using it to carve out exclusive access for its own producers. So a rather critical, if not hostile, position to the idea that the US might grant greater protection for EU geographical indications. Now, although the consortium has undoubtedly captured the political attention in the US, for example, 50 US senators signed a letter to the US trade representative supporting the argument that the US should not concede the EU position, at least with respect to some of these common names. We should recognize that there is a movement in the United States also to protecting geographical indications, and so there could well be some support for greater protection also in the US. The problem really concerns these common or generic names, which, as I say, are names that have become part of the public domain as a description for a particular type of food. We might take Parmesan, for example, which would be perhaps recognized now as the name for a particular type of sort of salty, hard cheese. And there's generally little objection to what we might call compound names. So examples might be mozzarella di bufalo. So mozzarella would be the single name, but mozzarella di bufalo or camembert de Normandie, where there is a very specific geographical indication linked to the common name. In the United States, quite a number of sort of typical European cheese and meat names have become widely used, mainly because of the emigration of Italian and other European immigrants who brought their cheese making or sausage making skills with them. And it's also the case that the EU recognizes the issue of common names, although we have not an agreed list of common names. But, for example, names such as Parmesan, mozzarella, provolone, tome, cheddar, Gouda, these are actually not protected as such within the European Union. They're only protected if they actually are linked to, for example, Gouda Holland is a protected GI, but not Gouda on its own. But the US fears that the EU sort of wants to push the boundaries, and it uses the example of Havarti cheese. Now, Havarti cheese is made in Denmark, but in many other countries at the moment. And there is, in fact, a standard, a codex standard for Havarti, which was agreed, I think, in 2007. But Denmark has lodged an application for GI status in the EU, which would imply that in the future only Danish Havarti, only Danish producers would be allowed to use the name Havarti on their cheeses. And of course that would exclude many producers in other countries, including the United States, if the EU were to agree to that and then look for protection for that name. Perhaps it's useful to remind ourselves that the EU has been trying to improve protection for GIs also in other free trade agreements with other countries. And by looking at what has been achieved, we maybe get some idea of what the hoped for outcome in the TTIP negotiations might be. And in its bilateral free trade negotiations, the EU has succeeded in getting higher protection, but for limited numbers of GIs. So we've seen that, for example, in the food area, we have almost 1,200 GIs in the European Union. In general, the lists in these other agreements rarely exceed 200. So only a limited number of GIs have been protected. But there's very different scope of protection in each of these agreements, and the lists of the names differ from one agreement to the other. Perhaps the most interesting is the most recent agreement, which has been agreed with Canada, not yet ratified and implemented. But it's interesting that that agreement contains specific exemptions for some European GI names, such as Asiago or Feta, Fontina, Gorgonzola, Munster, so that these names can continue to be used by Canadian producers. So the EU has shown some flexibility in these other agreements. So what are the implications for the TTIP negotiations on geographical indications? I think that we need to recognize that much of the impetus for the inclusion of GIs is perhaps political as much as economic. The EU doesn't expect to make gains in the agricultural sector arising from a free trade agreement. In fact, it has rather defensive interests. But so GIs, in a sense, are seen as making up the balance, showing that also for agriculture there can be some potential gains. And I just raised some questions here as to, how really important would it be if we were to get greater protection for European GIs in the European market. Certainly, some GI names are heavily protected. The champagne producers, for example, are very strict in trying to protect the use of their name. But is it the case that American consumers generally do not distinguish between a Gorgonzola which is actually made in Italy from a Gorgonzola which is made in the United States? Would it really benefit European producers to have this stronger protection? As I said, the US opposition is really focused on this threat to the common names because American producers have maybe for 40, 50, 60 years been producing using these names, and they worry about the possibility that they could lose that right. So to wrap up, on the surface, there's actually seemingly little space between the two positions. Both support protection of brands, including geographic indications. Both sides recognize that generic names in common use should not be given protection, and both recognize that there are a handful of conflicting names. But on the American side, they worry about the possible loss of well-established names in their own market. They worry about the lack of clarity over what the EU is prepared to accept as a list of common or generic names. And they worry that the EU has been using its bilateral free trade agreements to expand protection of its GIs at the expense of US exporters to those markets. So I conclude with a tweet. Phil Hogan, the Commissioner for Agriculture, was in the United States recently, and he gave us his view that, for 95% of European GIs, this is not really an issue. But there are these very small number of sort of common names which are protected in the European Union and which the US feels strongly should not be protected in the US. In my view, GIs are perhaps a relatively minor issue in the overall negotiations. Disagreements should not prevent an overall agreement from being reached, but they are an irritant that needs addressing. And it seems to me the EU perhaps should be more clear in its messaging to the US as to exactly what it wants to achieve in this particular area. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of fear, which perhaps could be dispelled if we were clearer in our objectives with respect to this dossier. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Perfect.
Thanks,
perfect. Thank you, Alan, for the presentation. We got some questions in already. I'm sorry if we don't have time to answer all of them. So there is one question from our participants that says there are already quite many conflicts between the American and European products that hasn't been solved for many years, and that he thinks that it seems now very unlikely to solve the conflicts in the 2-3 years coming. Is such agreement as TTIP really possible to be agreed upon?
I think the questioner is quite right to point to the fact that many of the issues that we are trying to address in this TTIP agreement actually have been the subject of negotiations going back over 10, 15 years, even longer. And in fact, this division of opinion on how best to protect GIs. We have our system in Europe, and the Americans have their trademark system. This distinction goes back many decades indeed, and has divided the two sides. So it's a very good question whether we can try to resolve these issues in a relatively short time. Certainly in some areas, I think the TTIP is going to be what some refer to as a living agreement. In other words, it's not going to try to settle all issues at the outset, but it will put in place mechanisms or procedures which might allow these issues to be resolved over time. But as I say, for the geographical indications, the space between the two sides is perhaps not that great, although it is obviously highly important and highly sensitive, particularly for countries in southern Europe like Greece with Feta, Italy with Fontina, Asiago, Gorgonzola. There are a limited number of names which are dividing the two sides, and I think it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that this can be resolved at this time.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for the answer. I hope that's clear to the participant what you think about this issue. And the next question would be, why should we worry about these European products with geographical indications? They only have marginal economic interest. Wouldn't it be better to focus on the main agriculture and food sectors?
I think also this is a very good question. I think we need to perhaps be a little bit more clear-headed and objective about what is at stake in this issue. Because clearly, if we are making it an offensive issue, this is something that we are looking for concessions from the American side. Then, of course, we also need to give something in exchange, and the question is really how valuable would be the additional protection that we would gain. Certainly for some products, export sales are important in the United States, and the producers do feel that their sales are adversely affected by sort of misleading information on competitors' products. So where an American producer puts an Italian flag or writes the name of the product with an Italian sounding name to try to give the impression that this is actually an Italian product when it's not. But there are relatively few products that are important in this area. Many of these are not in contention. The Americans are willing to accept, for example, that Parmigiano Reggiano is indeed a GI, and Parmesan is not a GI, and indeed is not a GI in Europe either. You know, I think it is a good question to ask. How really important is this relative to the broader issues at stake, not just in the agricultural and food sector, but in the other sectors, manufacturing, services, rules, and so on as well. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. And I'm aware of the time, so one more question that came in, if you could answer shortly. So the question is, almost all of your examples are products from the bigger European countries. Will also the products from the smaller European countries be protected properly?
Well, of course, it's the products from it's not so much from the larger European countries. These are perhaps the better known products, but these are the ones which have export potential. If we look at sales of GIs in general, 60% of the sales are made within the home country, in other words, the country of that GI. Another 20% of sales are made to other European countries, and just 20% of overall GI sales are exports, so in other words, sales outside the European Union. So for the majority, the great majority of European GIs, these are names which are not particularly well known outside their region, so they don't have perhaps much scope to attract a premium on export markets. So I think that's why the focus is on the relatively small number of very well-known names, where export sales are important and do add up to many millions of euro.
Okay, perfect. I think that's all the time we had today, and I'm sorry if you didn't get your question answered. What I would suggest and encourage you to do is to visit the caneucapit.eu platform and post the questions there under CAP forums /webinars. I will make sure that Alan visits the website. He's one of the CAP Pro learning module authors, so I'll make sure that he gets your question answered. And well, Alan, thank you so much for today's session and the Q&A. We appreciate you were able to join us today, and that would be all from us today. This is the end of the webinar, and I thank the rest of partners and supporting organizations such as Agriregionieuropa, Associazione Alessandro Bartola, Università Politecnica della Marche, European Commission, and Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs for making this webinar possible. Thank you, everyone. Alan, goodbye. And if you'd like to stay in touch, please make sure that you visit the platform and post your questions there.